Welcome, and thank you for listening to Sandy Creek Stirrings. I'm your host, Joshua Jimenez.
And if you're going to win souls, you've got to love souls. In spite of their meanness, in spite of the way they look, in spite of everything, you've got to seek to bring souls to Jesus Christ because you love them, because Jesus loved them, and because Jesus died for them, and you're trying to bring them to the Son of God.
The Bible says in Psalm 84:11, my last verse, "For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly." I've based my whole life on that it pays to serve God, and I believe that with all my heart.
God has given us a guidebook. God has given us a directional map. And that guidebook, that map, is the precious Word of God.
Listen, don't just go and sit in the pew. Find some way to serve, and serve as a family. Be a part of everything at church. And when you learn to love what God loves, your children will learn to love it as well.
Homes are not that spiritually strong. We're getting overtaken by the world quickly, but unfortunately, we're pumping all the sewage in. We're letting the world in when that ought to be a haven.
Let me put a disclaimer out there right off the bat on today's episode. This episode on vaccines has absolutely nothing to do with the COVID-19 vaccine. It won't be mentioned. It won't even be considered on today's episode, and I want to let you know that right off the bat. Now, we are going to pick up right where we left off from Friday's episode. If you have not listened to the first part of this little episode series on vaccines, and today will be the last part, if you haven't listened to the first part yet, you need to go back and listen to that first part first to know where we're coming from. Now, I'm not going to do an in-depth review. I want you to go back. Hopefully, you've already listened to that episode before this one, and you'll know exactly where we were at. But just to give you a little reference to remind you of where we were at in this episode, we began by talking about the facts versus the myths in regards to looking at vaccines in general. We began talking about the 1961 abortions, the two abortions of where the lungs of those babies were taken, and the cells were used to produce vaccine cultures. Cultures were then taken from the cells and used to produce only four, not all vaccines, but only four: the rabies vaccine, the rubella vaccine, the varicella vaccine for chickenpox, and the hepatitis A vaccine. And we began to separate, though, the facts from the myths. All right, there's a lot of myth that people often say, there's aborted babies in vaccines. That's a myth, and we talked about why that's a myth in the last episode. Now, as we began to move forward, where we've just ended was we began to challenge the logic of that line of thinking. Is it a logical stance for us to take? How does the logic hold up? And so we began asking some questions, and we started with this question. We said, is the stance against vaccines because of abortion? Is it an issue of principle or preference? All right, we talked about principle being a fundamental truth that serves as the foundation for a system of beliefs, behaviors, or reasonings. And we explain that by the Bible for many Christians it's my sole authority. But the sad truth is, it's for a lot of them, it's not a principle. It's a preference, because sometimes they follow it and sometimes they don't. That's a preference, not a principle. And so, in the same way, for most people, I see who are against vaccines because of the abortion issue. They stand against it as if it's a principle, but their stand is actually a preference. Now, that's not all people, but that's most people I see. And right here is about where we left off in the last episode on this topic of vaccines. Now, what do I mean? They claim that they stand against vaccines because it supports abortion. Now, if that's the stand they want to take, I don't have an issue. As I said in the last episode, my goal is not to get anybody to change sides. My goal is just to challenge you to think, And as I mentioned in the last episode, I'm very clear that I stand against abortion. Go back and listen to episode number 65. We did a whole episode dedicated to the topic of abortion, calling it on-demand murder. And so I'm very clear where I stand. I'm not trying to get you to change what side you're on, but simply to think through the process and sort the facts from the myths and come to a logical, good principle conclusion. Now, if that's the stand they want to take, they're against vaccines because of the abortion issue, that's fine. I don't have a problem with that. But the problem I see is that most of these people support abortion in various other ways, by doing business with businesses that give money to abortion clinics like Planned Parenthood. Now, there's a list of over 39 on multiple sites, okay, including a list on the familycouncil.org, a list of 39 businesses and organizations that directly give money to organizations like Planned Parenthood. And by the way, they're not clickbait lists. They're legitimate, researched out resources. And so you can find those lists on multiple sites, including familycouncil.org. But I wanted to give you some of the common ones that you've heard of from those lists. And so here are some businesses that give money directly to Planned Parenthood: Allstate, American Express, AutoZone, Bank of America, Bath and Body Works, BP Gas, Clorox, Dockers, Energizer, ExxonMobil, Frito-Lay's, General Electric, Intuit, Jiffy Lube, Johnson & Johnson, Kraft Heinz, Levi Strauss, Microsoft, Nike, PayPal, Pepsi, Progressive Insurance, Starbucks, Shell, United Airlines, Verizon, and Wells Fargo. Now, what's my point? Most people who claim to be against vaccines because of abortion, they claim it as a principle thing. I'm a person of principle, so I stand against them. But they love Starbucks. They have an American Express card. They love their Bath and Body Works products. They use Clorox in their home. They stop at their local Shell station for gas. They eat Lay's potato chips with their movie at night. They have Energizer batteries in their TV remote. They have GE light bulbs in their lamps. They have a Johnson & Johnson bottle of baby shampoo for their children. There's a bottle of Heinz ketchup and a jar of Kraft mayonnaise in their fridge. They wear Levi's when they work outside. They have a computer that runs Microsoft. They wear Nikes when running. They use PayPal when they shop online. They drink Pepsi with their potato chips, and they let Flo from Progressive insure their car. They have Verizon for their cell service, and they bank with, Bank of America or Wells Fargo. The fact is, for most people, their stance against vaccines on the issue of abortion is actually a stand of preference, not one of principle. How's that? Well, if it was a stand of principle, they would never go near any of those places we listed. By the way, as I said, that's not all of them. Go look at the actual list. The issue lies in the fact that most people stand against vaccines. They preach it and teach it like it's a principle, but truly within their own lives, it's a preference. They proclaim it like it's a principle, but they follow it based on preference. Can I say this? And as I said, I'm not trying to get anybody to change camps today, but that stance is one that's double-hearted. It's saying one thing and it's doing another. That's just the logic behind it. The logic does not fit. Now, I don't mind if you want to stand against vaccines based on this abortion issue and say, that's my stand. But you can't get up on a soapbox and say everybody should be against abortion because you bunch of abortion supporters, and then you've got Starbucks in your hand. That does not work. That's preference, not principle. Okay, so that's the first question I wanted to challenge our logic is our stand one of preference or principle? And by the way, that question should be asked to any of your beliefs. It doesn't matter if it's a belief on abortion, on the Bible, on church, on what denomination you are. Is it a thing of principle or preference? That question should be asked to any belief you have, and it will challenge your logic and your thinking. Number two, I've got another question to challenge our logic. Can God not bring something good from bad beginnings? Can God not bring something good from bad beginnings? To be clear, I do not believe that the ends justify the means. I believe that it's wrong to do right. But God can take something bad, something very bad, and work behind the scenes to make something good come out of it. I think Joseph said it best after he had been sold as a slave by his brothers, after he'd been charged though he was innocent, after he spent unneeded time in prison. Here's what he said in Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20. He said, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass as it is this day." Notice what the purpose was, to save much people alive. My friend, God is capable of taking something that began with terrible circumstances and allow something good to come out of it. That's why we often refer to God. One of his names is Providence. That's the title alone tells you that's just the way providence works. The problem with using the abortion issue to deny vaccines is denying the fact of God and his providence. Do the cells from these vaccines for these vaccine cultures have terrible beginnings? Absolutely. Absolutely. They have terrible, wretched beginnings. Abortion is never right. It's wicked. It's evil. Just as Joseph used that same word in that verse we talked about. But does that mean that God cannot take this situation and allow something good to come out of it? I mean, remember when we went back and we separated the facts from the myths, these abortions were never planned for the purpose of vaccines. A doctor came along after the terrible outcome and said, is there anything good that can come out of this? In this, he preserved those lungs and the cells were used to grow vaccine cultures. Have good things come from these terrible beginnings? Absolutely. Thousands and thousands of lives have been saved. Just kind of reminds you of that verse that Joseph mentioned. Take the following examples from just 3 of the 4 vaccines grown in the cells from the abortions in 1961. Now remember, as we said, not all vaccines have something to do with the abortions in 1961. Only 4 vaccines do. Here's an example from 3 out of 4 of them of how they have helped to save lives. In other parts of the world, 59,000 people die the severe rabies death a year. 59,000. Why? Because many other parts of the world don't have the rabies vaccine readily available in times of need. Only a handful of people die in the U.S. each year from rabies because of the vaccine being readily available. It's a 100% effective against something that has a 100% mortality rate. And here's what I find. The same people who often stand against vaccines because of the abortion issue, their child will get bit by a dog, a rabid dog, and they'll rush that child to the ER, and the doctor will give that child a vaccine to make sure that child doesn't get rabies. And that's exactly what I think the parent should do. Don't get me wrong. I think the parent should rush their child to the ER. But the fact is they're violating their own principle. But the rabies vaccine has rescued thousands and thousands of lives every year within the U.S. Rubella can cause, the rubella vaccine comes from those cells. Rubella can cause brain infections, bleeding problems, spleen or liver damage, deafness, heart defects, brain disorders, bone alterations, and more. It's especially dangerous for babies in the womb. But thankfully, because of this vaccine, the rubella vaccine, rubella has been declared no longer endemic, which means constantly present, since 2015 in the USA. By the way, the rubella vaccine is said to prevent over 5,000 miscarriages a year. That means there are 5,000 children living in 2021 who made it out of the womb because of the rubella vaccine. The fact is, these vaccines do save lives. The chickenpox used to kill 1,000 people a year, hospitalize over 10,000 people a year. Not only that, but 4 million people a year used to get the terribly itchy disease, chickenpox. Since the vaccine was released, what's known as the varicella vaccine, fewer than 20 people die a year from chickenpox. That's 1,000 down to 20. Fewer than 1,700 people are hospitalized. That's down from 10,000 to 1,700. And less than 350,000 get chickenpox every year. Now, that sounds like a big number, but remember, we're going down from 4 million to 350,000. Now, let me state it again. To be clear, I am very much against abortion. Let's reiterate the fact. No current-day abortions go to the vaccine industry. Okay? I want to be clear on both of those things again. I stand against abortion, but let's also reiterate the fact that no current-day abortions go to the vaccine industry. You may find a clickbait article on Facebook or a clickbait video on YouTube that says otherwise, but do your research. Is not fact. It's a myth. Here's the deal. God can allow something good to come from something that has terrible beginnings. Now, it's clear from the facts just listed that there are some good things that God has allowed to come from the terrible beginnings of these vaccines. But the truth is, We can't deny things just because they have terrible beginnings. And just because you accept that thing does not mean that you are complicit with the terrible beginning it had. Let me give you some practical examples. In January 1996, 9-year-old Amber Hagerman was abducted in broad daylight. She was seen kicking and screaming as she was thrown into a black pickup truck. 4 days later, her body was found. She was brutally murdered and thrown in a creek bed behind an apartment complex. A few days later, a lady in Fort Worth called a radio station and recommended that radio stations put out alerts when a child was abducted. They could call the program Amber Alerts. Since Amber Alerts began 25 years ago in 1996, it has helped to recover 897 children. I ask you this, should we reject and vocally stand against Amber Alerts because of their bad beginnings? By accepting an Amber Alert on your phone, are you supportive of children being abducted and murdered? Absolutely not. But what may sound ridiculous is that's the same logic. The same logic that's used to stand against these vaccines because of those 2 abortions in 1961 is the same logic we could use to stand against Amber Alerts. How about this one? Should the disciples, such as Ananias and Barnabas, have pushed the Apostle Paul away because of his terrible beginning? If you read the book of Ephesians or tell others to read any of the books that Paul wrote, are you complicit and supportive of persecuting Christians? Absolutely not. That's called providence. He took something from terrible beginnings and he worked something good for it. That's providence. How about this one? Should we reject the resurrection of Jesus Christ because it all began with a crucifixion? Are we supporting crucifixion as a means of death by accepting the resurrection? Absolutely not. Now, that may sound like some crazy statements to you, but when you look at the reasoning, the logic, it's the same used by those who reject vaccines because of the terrible beginnings. It's discrediting the fact that God can bring something good from terrible beginnings. Number 3, should we throw away medical knowledge that can save lives because of the way it was gained? Should we throw away medical knowledge that can save lives because of the way it was gained? Look, sadly, whether we like it or not, medical knowledge, whether your stance is you're completely against vaccines or whether you're completely for vaccines, it really doesn't matter because whether you like it or not, medical knowledge has been gained through the usage of cells from the abortions in 1961. I don't want to sound cruel or mean or uncaring in any way, but we can't take a time machine and go back and stop those abortions. We can't go back and stop the doctor from taking those lungs. We can't go back and change the reality that we now know some things medically because of what was done. And we have some medical knowledge now that can save thousands of lives. But do we take it all and throw it away? Throw what has the ability to save lives just because of where it came from? Look, I find this line of thinking to be a great conundrum. I mean, we see this also exemplified in the realities of medical testing in Nazi concentration camps. You say, how's that? Well, allow me to explain. During World War II, Nazis took the Jews and basically exterminated them in German concentration camps. But many of these so-called Nazi doctors, they're truly wicked, absolutely wicked, vile, evil men, would take some of these prisoners and conduct quote-unquote medical experiments. And look, it was absolutely horrendous, wicked, evil. I completely stand against what was done during any part of the Holocaust, as any caring person should. But when conducting this quote-unquote research is what they called it, they recorded all the results and the tests and the findings and kept the files. After the war, these horrendous files came to the knowledge of the public. And though the actions were vile and wicked, there was some medical knowledge that was exposed to the world, such as how to correctly identify hypothermia and how to try and treat it from preventing people to freeze to death, the dangers of high altitude exposure on the human body, the effects of multiple x-rays and too much radiation on the human body. There's some other things as well, but look, I completely disagree ethically and morally with how this information was obtained. But I find it to be a great conundrum. What do? Do we throw away the knowledge we now have? Do we let somebody who has hypothermia, do we just not treat it? Do we not recognize it? Like say, well, I don't know for sure if that's hypothermia or not. Do we just throw it away and just leave that person to die? Look, what these Jewish prisoners went through was horrendous. But what do we do with the knowledge now? Do we throw it away and let more people die, or do we use the knowledge for good? Do we try and take that and use the knowledge to honor those who were so brutally murdered and saving the lives of others? Look, there are many Jews who believe that by using that information, you're helping to honor those who went through those things. Now, the murder of those two babies in 1961 was terrible. Yet, no matter which side we stand on, yet do we throw away the knowledge we now have? To reject that information is to let hundreds of thousands of people die. Is that the right decision? And I can't tell you the answer for that decision, but I want you to think about it. Is that the right decision, to let hundreds of thousands of people die? Number 4, on questioning our logic, should those who stand against vaccines because of abortion, shouldn't they also stand against organ donors? Now, I'm sure there are some who are against people being an organ donor, but much of the same principles can apply. There's a couple sub-questions I want to ask within this question. For instance, letter A, let's say you desperately needed a kidney transplant. Time was growing short, your time of death was close at hand. If you didn't get a kidney transplant, you were going to die. All right? One day the doctor comes rushing in, he says, hurry, we've got to get you to the operating room, we have to hurry, we found you a kidney, we have to hurry, and they're rushing you out, and you say, how was one found so quick? And the doctor responds, well, they just found a guy who had been murdered just seconds before his body was found. They were able to preserve the kidney. It's a match. He was an organ donor, so we need to hurry. I ask you this. Would you deny the kidney? Some might. Very few for sure. But the reality is most who stand against vaccines because of abortions would accept the kidney. Now, you may be struggling to see the point, but it's contained in the logic. The organ was donated because of murder. By accepting the life that the kidney gives you, are you supporting murder? No, you're not. Then I ask you this, why is the answer not the same for the issue of the abortions and vaccines? Letter B, I'm not the firstborn in my family. Now, most of the time I'm referred to and refer to myself as the firstborn, but I'm truly not. I have a big sister that was born before me. Early in the marriage of my parents, they found out they were pregnant with a little baby girl. With much joy and excitement, pregnancy began. They began for this sweet and precious child to be born. One day in the doctor's office, they received bad news. The baby had Turner syndrome. It was a chromosome disorder, and the baby most likely would not survive. Doctor at that time recommended they have an abortion. Now, my parents chose to not have an abortion and to keep the baby. And sadly, with much heartache, the little girl, her name was Bethany Christine, died in the womb. It was far enough into the pregnancy where my mom had to give birth to that little stillborn baby. After the birth, my parents had her body, and they donated her body for the purpose of research. You say, why? Because at that time, not much was known about Turner syndrome. If doctors, here's what they were thinking, if doctors could look at that little body, figured out what happened, and helped to prevent another couple from going through that same heartbreak, then wouldn't it be worth it? My question to those who stand against vaccines because of abortion is, were my parents wrong to donate her body for research? Because the reasoning you use says they were. Letter C. Last but not least, in the area of bodily donation, an estimated 6.8 million people donate blood each year in the USA. Remember this, just one donation of blood can save 3 lives. Now, many Christians are repulsed by the fact that Jehovah's Witnesses refuse blood transfusions. That may be the first time you've heard of that, but it's a legitimate thing. Jehovah's Witnesses reject blood transfusions. Among many other beliefs, the Jehovah's Witnesses believe that life is in the blood, and it's wrong to take life from another. Now, if a Jehovah's Witness family is in a terrible car wreck, and the child is severely wounded, desperately needing a blood transfusion, those Jehovah's Witness parents will let their child die because they won't give that child a blood transfusion. Now, many Christians are outraged at the fact, rightfully, I believe, outraged by the fact that the Jehovah's Witnesses are doing this. They're allowing literally people to die. In fact, there's a study out, the exact number is not known, but they estimate about 1,000 Jehovah's Witnesses die every year from rejecting blood transfusions. But the Christians who are so often outraged by this, who stand against the vaccines because of the quote-unquote abortion issue, are outraged, but the reality is the Jehovah's Witnesses are using the same logic as those who deny vaccines. They're using the same logic. They believe, a fundamental belief for them is they believe it to be an issue of morality, so they base their decision off of it. It doesn't matter if it's going to save the life of their child or not. They're going to stand against it based on their principle. So we can't be outraged against them if we are going to use that same logic. Now, I simply wanted in this episode series to challenge the logic and get you to think. I'm not trying to change what side you're on. I'm not trying to get you to change camps. I just wanted you to think about it, look at the facts, expose the myths, and help us to make the wisest biblical choice in this area. Now, something as divisive as this can often lead to many, many opinions, but I believe that we can have this conversation, like the one we've had, with much passion, yet without offenses that are unnecessary. So you may ask, I started off by telling about how my wife, when we were first expecting our child, how we began to talk about, we both came from different camps in the vaccine world. Now we were our own family. We had to make our decision for ourselves in the same way you do. We live in America, a land of liberty and freedom. You decide for yourself. You have to make the choice. Take the facts, expose the myths, challenge your logic, and make the decision that is best for your family. So you may be asking, what did you and your wife do? What was the happy middle ground you found? Well, the steps I'm about to give below are not only effective for talking about vaccines, but an area of difference within your marriage. What we did first is we sat down, we had a good conversation. A good conversation. It's vitally important for couples when they reach an area of contention to get alone, sit down, and talk it through. Look, you and your wife, you and your spouse, you and your husband, you grew up in 2 different families, came from 2 different homes. And for me and my wife, fundamentally, our previous homes had many similarities. But there were many various different ways we were accustomed to doing things. And that included the issue of vaccines. My wife grew up learning one way, and I grew up leaning another way. And, we had to find for us, for my family, and it could be different than you, but we had to find what was a happy compromise for us. So we sat down and had a good conversation. That's what you need to do as well on this topic or any topic within your marriage. And some good tips on that is, by the way, pray before you start. Ask the Lord to help you. You're now 2 becoming 1, and you need to make the wisest decision for your family. Get alone. Get a babysitter. Wait till the kids are in bed, but get alone. All right? Brew some coffee or some tea. Have something to sip on. Determine to remain calm, but still energetic within the conversation. Determine to not get nippy or let anything come out of your mouth before you have completely thought it through. Have a notebook and a pen. Write down some thoughts so that you don't interrupt your spouse when they're trying to say something. Don't make any stonewall statements. You say, what? Statements like, well, if we aren't going to do it my way, then I don't know if we can make this work. Look, those statements are just harmful to your marriage. And on your part, that's just stubbornness, by the way. The Bible says that stubbornness is as the sin of idolatry, idol worship. And 1 Samuel 15:23, don't make stonewall statements. And by the way, it's okay if you don't make a decision that time, right then. But make sure to come back together and finish the conversation. So we started by having a good conversation. Number 2, we did our research. That's important for you as well as you're making a decision for your family. Do your research. It's important to sit down and to research out whatever the topic is. Read articles, watch videos, and learn not to accept one person's view. And don't just believe something you saw on Facebook. Do your best to compare facts with facts, never opinions. Compare facts with facts, never opinions. Ask others who have been in the same boat as you what they found and what decision they made. And then learn to counsel, especially with your pastor, but learn to take counsel. So we had a good conversation. We did our research. Number 3, we made the best decision for our family. At some point, when it comes to things that there are no biblical principle, biblical example, or clear passage within Scripture, you and your spouse have to decide what is best for you. Now, if the Bible is clear, it doesn't matter whether you like it or not. You need to stick with what the Bible says. But on some things, like this issue, like the issue of vaccines, you have to make the best decision for your family. Now, it may be leaning more towards the husband viewpoint. It may be leaning more towards the wife's viewpoint. And most often, it's wisest to compromise right in the middle. Now, when you make that decision together, don't go against it when you are alone. All right? If you've made a decision together as a family, then don't defy that decision when you're on your own. When you're at the doctor's office alone by yourself, stick to the decision you made together. So for my wife and I in the area of vaccines, here's the happy middle ground for us. This may be different for you and your family, and that's perfectly fine. Each family has the liberty and freedom to make their own decisions. Today's episode wasn't about trying to get you to change your camp. It was just about getting you to see the facts, expose the myths, and challenge your thinking. So here's the happy middle ground for us. For us, we don't have our babies get their vaccines right away. Okay? We wait for them to grow a little bit, build up their immunity system a little bit. At 2 to 3 months of age is when we have them get their first vaccine. We called around and we found a doctor that walks us through exactly what a vaccine is. He helps to confirm our research. He helps us with how it's used. How long has it been around? That's a big factor for me. How long has the vaccine been around? And so then we found a doctor that allows us to divide up their vaccinations so they don't get them all right at once. There's a set period of time between the individual vaccinations, so that way we can very clearly tell if our child is having an issue with a vaccine and what vaccine that is. Now, thankfully, we haven't ever had anything like that. We haven't ever had any issues, but we can tell immediately what vaccine it is they're having an issue with. We wait to receive vaccines that are new and don't have much data to go off of. I want to see what they're actually doing. And so in the end, yeah, our children are vaccinated, but we do it in a way that my wife and I are most comfortable with. For us, it is the happy medium between the two camps. Now, what's your stance? Is your stance based on the facts or is it based on the myths? Is your stance, does it have good logic behind it? Does it make sense? Does it actually reason well? Is it based on principle or preference? Does it allow for God to still be providence? And then, what's your stance as a family? What's the happy middle ground or happy left ground or happy right ground for you? You have to make the decision for you as a family. But this was just a look at vaccines in general, taking a look at the facts, exposing the myths, and challenging our logic. I hope this episode has helped you in more ways than one, not just on the vaccine issue, but learning to think through every decision and measure you take within your family. My friend, keep serving God, no matter what your stand on vaccines is. And as you do, keep looking up and keep stirred up for the cause of Christ.